Can you believe it? It's already Tuesday night. What are you doing at home on a Tuesday night? Well, I'm telling you what I'm doing on a Tuesday night. We're going to talk about grief tonight. There's a lot of loss, and really, grief is about the experience of going through loss. So you can grieve the loss of a parent. Perhaps they've passed on beyond the veil. Perhaps you've lost a marriage through divorce. Maybe you've lost a child due to death. And I tell you, I can't even imagine. I don't think a parent should have to bury a child, let alone two of them, as we'll talk about tonight. There's a lot of loss in our life, and 2020, I think, could be summed up by the word loss. And there was a lot of grief in 2020 because of these feelings. And we talked a lot in 2020 about the deaths of despair, and just a lot of the despair because we're being taught to live in fear. Fear is a terrible place to live. So when we talk about that pyramid of motivation, we talk about most people, wholly 80 or 90% of our population is motivated by fear. Fear of loss. I have to is the internal self-talk of someone motivated by fear. I have to. I have to go to work. I have to do this for my spouse. I have to do this for my children. Wholly, most of our population lives there. Then there's a few more, a very small percentage of our population that live by duty. Internal self-talk of these folks is I ought to go to work. I ought to do this for my family. I ought to do this for my friends. It's duty. But the highest form of motivation is the motivating factor of love. And the internal dialogue there is I want to, or I choose to. And that's where we want to come from. So we need to move from this grief back through duty up to love. And that's a constant and never-ending process. And we're going to discuss that more tonight on this episode of Coz TV and the Coz Green audio experience. Tonight's program is being brought to you by StreamYard. Put the power of live streaming to work for your business, your brand, or your cause. Stream live to Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and others. Go to StreamYardCoz.com to sign up for your free account and get a $10 credit. That's StreamYardCoz.com. StreamYardCoz.com. And tell them Kazi sent you. And you'll get that $10 credit on your account. All right, here we go now. My guest tonight helps grievers. Bottom line, she helps grievers find purpose and joy again after loss. She's the host of the popular Build a Life After Loss podcast. She's a grief coach, a speaker, and the author of the new book, Miracles in the Darkness, Building a Life After Loss. She hopes her experiences with overcoming devastating losses can bring light and encouragement to others. She and her husband, Ron, have 6 beautiful children, including 2 angels and 10 grandchildren. She shares a message of hope across many platforms, including podcasts, national radio, and television. And we're pleased tonight to welcome her to the broadcast. Will you please, friends, put your hands together and help me welcome author, speaker, coach, Julie Cluff.
Thanks, Coz. It's so good to be here.
Welcome to the program. I'm sorry we're meeting under such interesting times and interesting topic tonight. Yeah. But it's a topic we all go through. Again, it's very cyclical. We all go through grief, and you can give us your definition of grief. And unfortunately, you've had various experiences with grief. So you're not going to talk to us through sympathy. You're going to talk to us tonight through empathy. And my heart just goes out to you for everything that you've been through. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I so appreciated what you said about, making our way back to love. Like, that's just huge. That's super, super important. And so often we stay in that place where our connection to the person that we loved, that we lost, becomes grief and pain. And really what we want to do is we want to get back to that place of love. So, yeah.
And that really is where we're seeking to live. And I have to admit, in my travels around the world and with people from all walks of life, not very many people have been able to honestly admit to me that they live in love. Most people, that's why I say 90 to 95% of people live in fear,
Yeah.
doubt, despair, and grief. So, to put this in context, tell us about the grief that you've experienced and how you're able to deal with helping others through grief from such a unique perspective.
Yeah, so I've had several grief experiences, but really the one that changed my life forever, I mean, they all changed my life. But the one that really brought me to my knees and made me question whether it was possible to come back was, happened on Mother's Day in 2007. So I was traveling across the country with my three youngest children. We lived in Houston at the time. We were traveling east, and I had my 12-year-old, my 10-year-old, and my 8-year-old in the car with me. My 10 and 8-year-old were in the back seat with their snacks. We were trying to keep everybody occupied and busy so we could make this day-long trip. And we'd left early in the morning, expected to get in the evening in North Carolina. The goal was to get there before it got dark. And we were having this amazing trip. The kids were cooperating, which is always a mother's dream. And then about mid-afternoon, we'd had lunch, and we were, we'd been listening to music, and we had been, just kind of having fun in the car. And my daughter, Carrie, who was 10, was sitting next to her 8-year-old brother in the back seat, and they'd been really playing happily. And then she said, you know what? She started to get bugged like older sisters do with little brothers. And she said, you know what? I'm gonna move to the other seat. So as she moved, I looked back over my shoulder and I saw her moving from the middle seat to the seat behind me. And as she changed seats, she said, Mom, I love you. Happy Mother's Day. And I said, I love you too. And I heard her snap in the car seat. And what feels like 10 minutes later, I suddenly found myself waking up in the median of the intersection between the eastbound and the westbound lanes. And I was so shocked, and we're bouncing along, and it's just shocking to find yourself in that position. And so as I tried to pull our big SUV back up on the highway going, 70 miles an hour, I felt the wheels lift up off the ground, and our vehicle started to roll. And it rolled and it rolled and it rolled. And when we landed, I had no eyesight. I'd hit my head. I couldn't see anything. I could hear my son James in the seat next to me crying. So I knew that he was alive, but I didn't know how severe his injuries were. But as I called for Carrie and David in the back seat, there was no answer. And I called and I called. And as my eyesight came back and I could see the shattered glass and the rubble and just the destruction around me. And as I looked back and tried to find them, I couldn't find them. And that's when I noticed people gathering in the grass to the left of me, yards, what felt like a football field away. And that's when I realized they'd been thrown from the car. And I was frantic, as you can imagine. And I didn't even know. I was stunned physically. I was stunned emotionally. But I knew in that moment that they either both had lived or they both had died. I just knew it. And unfortunately, they didn't make it. And I never saw them alive again. The last thing my daughter said was, I love you, Mom. Happy Mother's Day. So that brought me to a whole new level of grief that I had never experienced before. And it was a long road back. But I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful to share this story. I'm so grateful to share hope with people. that the story doesn't end there. The story doesn't end with grief, that there is hope. There's hope for all of us.
I said in the introduction that no parent should have to bury a child.
Yeah.
What was that like? Walk us through burying your two babies.
It was just devastating. As you can imagine, it was, there's no words. There really is no words to describe how devastating that is. There's no words to describe how crushed and how just absolutely shattered you feel in that moment. And of course, I felt completely responsible for the accident. I had never even had a moment, not even one moment of feeling tired on that entire trip. Never felt tired. And that's why it was so incredibly shocking. But it took, it was just, the ambulances showed up. They took Carrie and David to one hospital. They took James and I to another hospital, and they put me on a striker board. And when we got to the hospital, I just kept asking the workers, "What about Carrie and David? What about Carrie and David? Are they okay?" And they kept putting me off. And they said, "No, we haven't heard anything yet." That's what they kept telling me. "We haven't heard anything yet." Well, really, what they were doing was they were waiting for my aunt and uncle. We were in Mississippi, and they lived just an hour and a half south from where the hospital was. They were waiting for someone to get there to tell me that Carrie and David didn't make it. And when my aunt and uncle got there, my aunt said, "Ron's on the phone. That's my husband." And he was in the airport in Houston trying to get a flight out to Mississippi. It's just so devastating. And they put him on the phone and he said, "Julie, Carrie and David didn't make it." And I don't remember much else after that very moment. But a few minutes later, they told me that my son James was going in for emergency surgery. He had broken his leg in the accident, and there was a lot of pressure on his leg, and they needed to go in and relieve that pressure. Now, the reason my book is called Miracles in the Darkness is there were so many miracles that day. James went in for, they wheeled me in on my cot to talk to James before he went in for surgery. And I laid on my cot next to his cot and held his hand and said, "It's going to be okay." Of course, I didn't tell him that his little brother and his little sister were gone. It wasn't the time for that. But I told him, "It's going to be okay. They're going to help you." And he went in for surgery, and I heard one of the interns say, "I don't know why Dr. Rush is here. He's not supposed to be here today. It's a holiday. It's a Sunday." Dr. Rush's family, Dr. Rush himself the hospital was named after his family. Dr. Rush himself had developed the procedure that my son needed. No one can tell me that that wasn't a miracle that day. Lots of miracles.
Miracles are just things that happen that we just can't explain, right? That is just divine.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As the car rolled, I heard a voice tell me to bring my arm in. And I brought my arm in and I saved it. Because 2 or 3 months later, my uncle called me and he says, "I was just watching this program and there was this dancer and she had lost her arm in the same type of accident that you were in." 2 years after that, I met another woman that was in a rollover accident about the same time I was, and she had lost her arm in that accident. I think God knew I couldn't take any more loss than what I experienced, and he helped me save my arm that day.
How did that experience change your relationship with God in that moment?
Oh gosh, there's so many things. Like I can't even I already had a good relationship with God, but I had to go through the really, really deep, hard stuff and find him all over again. Like I saw him in the moments, but when you're so devastated, your emotions are so overwhelmed that it's really hard sometimes to feel God's presence. And I recognized these miracles in little ways early on, but as I had some time and perspective and some learning and some healing that I experienced through a lot of effort and a lot of resources and a lot of help, I was really able to put those pieces together and see all the miracles that happened. That day on the road, we were listening to an album. I don't know if you're familiar with the Nashville tribute band, but I had an album. It's called Joseph. It's a tribute to Joseph Smith.
Hmm.
And in on that album, there's a song about his wife Emma, who buried several of her children, babies. And as we listened to that music kind of over and over again that day, that was the song that really, really stood out to me, interestingly. I don't think there's any accident in that. And I really pondered on, how did she really feel? What did she really feel during that time? How did she make it? How did she go on? How did she experience that? All these thoughts ran through my head that day as we drove. And then when I found myself in that position of having to bury two babies, I knew better than I ever could have before how she felt that day, or how she felt with her experiences.
Was there anger at God? Anger
You
at
know,
yourself? Was anger ever part of the equation, or did you move beyond that quickly?
anger wasn't a huge part, like from my perspective, in remembering my experience, it wasn't a huge part, except that the anger was turned towards myself.
Hmm.
There was definitely a ton of self-forgiveness that I had to grow, that I had to experience, that I had to allow myself to experience, really very early on. So this accident happened in May, and about September, when they start putting the Halloween stuff up on the shelves, my during those months, if I walked into a store and I'd see something, I'd often think of Carrie and David. I think, oh, David would love this, or oh, Carrie would love this, and then I'd remember they weren't there. It's just like a constant shock over and over again that they weren't there. It's not that I didn't always remember. It's just I was always in the habit of thinking of them, of taking care of them, of them being a part of our life. And as I walked in one September day and I noticed that they had started putting the Halloween things up, I saw costumes hanging on the rack. And I saw this witch's costume that looked flowy and fun. And my immediate thought was, Carrie would love this. And then I remembered, I don't need to buy a costume for her this year. She's not here. And in my head, I said, God, why? Why did they have to go? And the answer that I got back was, how would you have liked it to happen?
Hmm.
And as I pondered that question, there was no good answer. Because my constant question was not only why did this happen, but why did I have to be driving the car? Why did it have to happen this way? So when I got that question back, how would you have liked it to happen? Like it really sunk in that this was no accident. I really truly believe that people go when it's their time, that no one goes early, that God has that all in his hands. We don't like it, but it's in his hands. but it was another, 2.5 years before I could hear his answer, before I could hear this was no accident, before I could understand.
How did you overcome the survivor's guilt and ultimately forgive yourself?
It was just a lot of work. I had PTSD from the accident, and within about 6 months, I was going to regular therapy. And I remember my therapist saying to me one day, she said, Julie, there's going to be healing. She says, I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. And she took me through some very specialized therapy in order to overcome my PTSD, which I was super grateful for. But about the second year, my depression, depression is very, very common with grief. It's part of the experience often. And mine was really, really hard, as it is for everybody. But I really went into a very, very dark depression. I really went into a very difficult time. And there was so much self hatred. And I had these thoughts and these feelings that the world would be better off without me. And that I had caused so much pain to my family. And I just blamed myself for everything. I blamed myself for everything. If one of my kids were upset, it was my fault. If my husband was having a hard time, it was my fault. Everything in my world was my fault at that point. And it was a really dark place to be. And I stayed in this really dark place for a while, and I'm trying to find some answers. There were some triggers that happened that kind of created this downward spiral. But on the month of the third anniversary of the accident, in that month, I received a special spiritual blessing. And it was like the lights went on immediately. Like it was like by the end of the day, I could see, like I could feel that dark cloud that had been living within me had lifted. And I received a miracle, another miracle that day. And I really struggled with, honestly, I really struggled with, because I know so many people out there are struggling. And I thought, why? Again, the why question, why did I get this miracle of having this darkness and this depression and this grief lifted from me in this way? And it really wasn't until it was when I was writing the book that I got such a strong impression that I received that miracle so that I can be here with you right now, looking you in the eye and saying healing is possible. That's why I received that miracle. It doesn't have to happen like that. Healing is a birthright. Healing is part of who we are. Healing is, you cut your finger, you heal. Healing is part of our birthright. And we just have to continue to hope for that. And unfortunately, so many of the messages that we get out there are not hopeful, are not helpful. You're going to grieve the rest of your life. I hear that over and over again, especially for parents who have lost children. And I understand the sentiment. I understand, because what we've done, and this goes to your point, Coz, is what we've done is we've built this bridge with our kids of grief. And so we feel like if we let go of that pain, if we let go of that grief, that we're letting go of our kids. But it's really remembering that our bond to our kids is eternal, and that bond is love. It's not grief and pain. And it's our, they're okay. Like I have every assurance that they're okay, that they're happy, that they're living an amazing existence right now. And one day I'll have an opportunity to go live with them in that same existence. But right now, my mission is here and their mission is there. And right now I get to choose, and this is a process. It's not an automatic. It's not like you wake up one day and say, today I choose love. Today I choose gratitude. I'm letting go of the grief. It's a process, but that's what we can do. We can choose the love and the gratitude. And that's what I help people do.
That was just one experience that ultimately prepared you for the next experience.
Well, actually, a little bit of the opposite.
So put this into perspective.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of a timeline. Learning what I have about grief, and this is the experience I have so often with my clients, is they realize that they've actually had multiple grief experiences. And I think 2020 really highlighted that for us, didn't it? But I had multiple grief experiences in my lifetime, but the one that really kind of was like this defining moment was when I was 28 years old and I lost my little brother to suicide. And that was so shocking and so unbelievable. I'll never forget that phone call. I'll never forget standing in my house and getting that phone call that my brother had died and that he'd shot himself. Like, I'll never forget that. I'll never forget going out to the washer and dryer because I had 2 little kids and I was moving laundry. And as I moved the laundry, I just said, John, why? Why? And that was really that very first experience where I was intimately connected with grief and pain, and understood at a deeper level what it was to live in this world and to experience these dark moments, because this is part of life. Loss has been going on from the beginning of time. We're no different in this generation than 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Loss has always happened. My understanding is we're made for this. We're made for this. Like, we are made for being able to experience these deep experiences, experience it in our bones, reconnect and re-put together the pieces of our life to reconnect with God in a deeper, more intimate way than we ever have before, because of the experiences that we've had that connects us to Him and His world. And losing my brother was just really the first super hard experience. And it wasn't long after that I found myself going through a divorce.
So your brother dies by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
You get divorced.
Mm-hmm.
Then you lose your 2 children.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to kind of put the pieces together a little bit, I had 3 children from my first marriage, and divorced, remarried. My second wonderful husband has been the dad of the 3 children from my first marriage, honestly, because my first husband left the country and they didn't see much of him after that. He's since passed away. But he became a husband and a father all on the same day. And 3, small children. When we got married, my youngest was not quite 2 years old. So they were, almost 2, almost 5, and almost 7 when we got married. So super, super young. So we had 3 more kids, and we raised them all together, and just, had this wonderful family life. I homeschooled my kids for a number of years. I was homeschooling at the time of the accident. And it was my 2 youngest, from the 6, from my marriage with my husband, Ron, who I'm currently married to, and for 28 years, who, those are the 2 that died in the accident.
Last week, Paul Cardall said on the program something profound that's been just staying with me, and your touching on that and reiterating that again today, that God seems to customize our curriculum just for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the important thing to remember, and this was part of my healing experience and part of my forgiveness experience, was understanding that not only had he customized my kids' experience who had passed away and my experience who was left behind to try to figure out how to put the pieces back together and live in this, devastating situation, but he had customized the experience for my other children, for my husband, for our extended family, everybody involved, our friends, everybody involved. There were almost 1,000 people at their funeral. And it was a beautiful funeral. It was a beautiful celebration of two beautiful children and their experiences while they were here on earth, and our experience with loss and grief and trying to figure it out. And, understanding that, I mentioned how I blamed myself. So easy to do. And it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, there may be people listening right now that said, of course you blamed yourself. You should blame yourself. Why did you take this long trip? All these things, right? That makes sense. It makes sense to us. But there really isn't blame to be had. Yes, it was my fault in earthly terms. It was my fault. I was the driver of the car. Maybe I was tired and I hadn't realized it. I have no recollection of that whatsoever. But I had two teenage boys. We went from a household of 8 people. My oldest daughter had left for college just before this trip. My second oldest graduated 2 weeks after the accident and left to go to college. And that spring, before the accident, all 8 of us had been home. My husband and I, 6 kids. All of us had been home. And within overnight, we went from 8 at home to 4.
Mm.
And I had 2 teenage boys at home. And I can tell you they grew up in a very different household than my girls did. That my girls that went off to college, I was present for them. I was there. But when I went through this devastating loss, obviously I was hurting. I was in pain. I was dealing with a lot and trying to figure it out. And I wasn't really there for my boys. I mean, I was, it wasn't like I left, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way, I was disconnected from life, which is so frequently our experience in grief. And to realize, to have that realization that this wasn't just my experience, that I wasn't 100% responsible for my boys' experience, that God had set up this curriculum, like you mentioned, for them too, that this was part of their experience in life, was to have a mother who wasn't all there, who was checked out because she was hurting. That was part of their experience. God knew that too. He not only knew that it was time for my children to die, to leave this earth, to go to the next, he also knew that my other children, that this was going to be their experience.
Help those watching and listening tonight understand time and that perspective of time. Because when we're knee deep in the kimchi, people line up to tell us, oh, it just takes time to get through it. And you're like, if I hear that one more time, that if I just hang on long enough, this is all going to go away.
Oh, I love this question, Coz. I love this question.
Where did you find the faith to persist through time?
Yeah. Because it's not just time, it's effort. It's a combination of time, effort, finding the right things that are going to help you, like finding that therapist that could do that specialized treatment that could help me with my PTSD. It was going back. It was things like I went back to play tennis. As soon as my shoulders were actually injured, my wrist was broken, it was fractured, and my shoulders were sprained in the accident. And then I dealt with some, what do you call that? Like, what is frozen? Sorry, I couldn't think of the word when your shoulder is frozen. So I dealt with some of that after the accident, from rolling. I mean, think about the miracle that I'm still here. Like, I shouldn't be here. My son, James, shouldn't be here. We're both here. And, we landed on the other side of the highway. When my eyes, when my sight came back, we're like facing the highway on the other side of a 2-lane highway. Like, we rolled and rolled and rolled. We shouldn't be here. But I had to heal physically and emotionally. The physical healing happened quicker. The physical injury was not as great. But think about a friend who just broke their leg. When I was in college, I was running up concrete steps barefoot. I don't advise it. Just what you think happened. My foot slammed against a concrete step and I broke my foot. And I didn't get up and go run 2 more flights of stairs. I didn't sit on the step and wait for time to heal it. That's not what I did. My friends gathered around me, gave me that support. They took me to a doctor who gave me a different type of support. I rested until it was healed. It wasn't just time that healed my foot. It wasn't just time that healed my shoulders, that healed my wrist. It was having that specialized help of having someone that could put a cast on it, that could give me the advice, that could tell me what I needed to do in order to heal properly. We don't tell a friend to get up and run on a broken foot. We shouldn't be telling our friends to get over it. It's not the way it works. It's continuing to put, that's why hope is so important. And I want to give you a different definition of hope as well.
Please.
In 1828, when I'm studying scripture, I love to use the 1828 dictionary. It gives me so much insight. And when you look up in the 1828 dictionary, hope, it basically says certainty of an outcome. That's godly hope. A lot of times we confuse hope with wishes. We say, I wish I could, I hope I could. And we use those terms interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. Hope is certainty. Because I had gone through that experience with my brother dying, and because I had gone through that devastating divorce that I went through, I knew that I could heal on some level. Like, I didn't know how. This was a whole different level of healing. It would be like comparing breaking a foot to being in an accident that crushes, half the bones in your body. Like, people heal from hard accidents, but it's harder. It takes more time. It takes more specialized help. It takes more effort on their part. They might need to learn to walk again. They might need to learn new skills in order to deal with the injury that they've sustained. But we don't, hope is certain. And if we can keep that in mind, if we can keep our hope high, it's one of the reasons I do the Build a Life After Loss podcast. One of the reasons I do it is because I want to give people encouraging hope. I want to give people the hope of certainty. I don't want to give people the wish of healing. I want to offer them the certainty of healing. I want to offer them the hope, the certain hope of healing.
That's very powerful. Thank you for that redefinition of hope. I think it's weakened since 1820.
It has weakened for sure.
1828, rather.
Yeah.
So once you got through this, notice we said through this, you didn't go around it, you didn't
No.
go over it. We have to go through it, right?
Hmm.
And it's unique to each and every one of us. How did you know that you were supposed to take those experiences to help others? When did you cross that bridge to service to others because of your experience?
Yeah, thanks for asking because this has been a real part of my journey for sure. It's all, when and I you probably have felt this as well, cause it's like you find yourself in a certain position and then you realize how all the events of your life had led you to this point. I was doing a podcast interview one time with Dr. Paul Jenkins, and he said to me, he says, "I'm guessing that at 10 years old, you didn't go, I'm going to be a grief coach when I grow up." And I said, "You're absolutely right. It never crossed my mind." And about 5 years after the accident, it was 2012. My mom had moved from Nashville to San Francisco to do some service work. And I had flown out there to help her drive her car back to Nashville. And she was so anxious for me to meet her friends that she had made while she was in San Francisco. Actually, I misspoke. She was in Sacramento. She was in Sacramento. So I flew out to Sacramento, and she was anxious for me to meet her friends. So she had arranged for the lady that she'd been working with, that she kept telling me, "She reminds me so much of you, Julie." So she arranged for us to go to lunch. Well, this woman's husband came along with us too. And over lunch, he shared with us his experience. He shared how he had dealt with bipolar depression for years, undiagnosed, and how that had created so much havoc in their family, in his life, in his career. And when he was finally diagnosed, which it hadn't been, I think it was less than 5 years before we met, that it was diagnosed, and they got him on some medication and they got him stabilized. And at that point, he was dedicating his time to helping other people that were dealing with the same thing, that were dealing with bipolar disorder, and were trying to figure out like how to live with this new diagnosis, or trying to figure out how to put the pieces back to their life that they had kind of undone while they were undiagnosed. And I was super enthralled in his story. What a good man he was. And my mom, while we are at lunch, she's like, "Julie, tell him what happened. Tell him what happened with Carrie and David." And it had been 5 years, and I had, had that miracle of the first level of healing at 3 years. So it'd been about 2 years, and I'd had more experiences that brought me to more healing. But I wasn't really used to sharing my story very much. And I reluctantly shared my story of losing Carrie and David. And when we got up from the table, as we left the restaurant, we were getting up from the table, and he came over to me, and he touched my arm, kind of like turned me towards him, and he said, "You're supposed to do something with this." And it hit me like lightning. And I knew he was right. But at that point, I was just like, I don't, looks like I don't know if I'm capable. Like that just felt really hard. It felt like I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But I knew it was true. I'd had that experience. I'll never forget it. It just went straight to my soul. It was as if, God himself came down and said, "Julie, you're supposed to do something with this," because he probably did. But it was a couple of years later, about 2 years later, and I was meeting with a massage therapist of all things, and we were chatting, and she had lost a son, and she was a very spiritual, good woman. And she said to me, she says, "You're supposed to do something with this." And I'm like, "Okay, I know, but what?" And I told her about how I was moving from Texas to Utah and we were opening a business. And she says, "Oh, tell me about the business." She was thinking this was going to be the answer. And as I told her about the business we were opening, she's like, "That's not it. That's not it." I said, "I know. I'm still looking. I'm still figuring it out." And a few months later, I thought, I'm just going to enroll. I'm going to go back to college. I'm going to become a therapist. That's what I'll do. That made the most sense. It was the quickest path to get into like really helping people who are grieving. It's just like our society has taught us that makes sense, right? Go back to school, get a degree, get another degree, get a new, certificate, whatever. And when I did that, I actually enrolled in classes. I went to classes for like 2 weeks and I was just like, this is not it. Like it was so, so, so clear to me. This is not it. And I unenrolled and I waited, but I kept searching. And then some things happened and I started working with a coach. I was running a business. I was doing a lot of things. I was running a business that was growing rapidly, and I was managing employees and so forth. And as I met with this coach, that's when I started to really kind of reconnect with myself and really reconnect with who I was and what I had to offer with the world. And over the months, it really became very apparent what I was supposed to do. And it's all part of the development. It's all part of the process.
How did you know?
Oh,
How was that path shown? So you were reminded by several different people, you're supposed to do something with this. Hey, tap you on the shoulder. You're supposed to do something with this.
yeah.
But when did you take action?
Well, while I was working with that very first coach, it was about 6 weeks in. I was doing like a 10-week program with them. I was trying to figure out, really why I had hired them. It was a husband and wife team. The reason I had hired them was because I wanted more balance in my life. Like I was really kind of sucked into my business. I'm a very responsible person, and so I was like really sucked in, and I was kind of losing myself in that process. But about 6 weeks in, I looked at what they were doing, and I thought, I could do this. Like I could really help people. Because when my therapist, at the 3-year mark, when I had this miraculous experience, and I went back to my therapist that following week and I told her what happened. And she's like, "Well, you don't need me anymore. You're done." I remember leaving that office and saying, I don't feel done. I still don't know what to do with my life. I still don't know what my life is supposed to look like. Yeah, I'm not suicidal. I'm not in this deep despair. Yeah, I can handle my day to day, but what am I supposed to do? Like what is it supposed to look like? And when I was working with this coach, like all of that came back to me and I thought, I could do this. Like I could be that person. I could be the person that bridges that gap between therapy, if that's necessary. It's not always necessary in grief, and rebuilding. Like I could do that. And that's when I started to take action. I immediately started looking for programs to help me become a coach. And I first trained as a life coach. And then because I love business, then I thought, oh, well, it would be fun to coach business owners. That would be fun. But that wasn't what I was there for. That's not why I was there. And so it was pretty quickly, like it took a few months. I was still running the other business. It took me a few months to kind of, work my way through that. But I knew from the time that I went to my very first coach training that really the reason I was there was to coach grief. And since then, I've gotten specialized grief training. I've developed my own program that really helps, because what I discovered was we kind of go through this coping phase, like that's what we do, right? Something hard happens, we go immediately into trying to cope, trying to figure out how to cope. And a lot of people can figure that out pretty well on their own. They can kind of figure out how to cope. But what happens is we get really discouraged in that place if we stay there for too long, because we either get messages from our friends, it's time to move forward. Sometimes they'll say it's time to move on. That can kind of get us upset. You don't know what I've been through type thing. But we start to feel that within ourselves too. We start to feel, yeah, maybe it is time. It's time for me to opt into more in my life. It's time. And what I realized was when people go from coping to try to rebuild, there's a lot of pieces missing in between. So they carry their grief, because what we do with our grief is at first it's very public, especially when it's a public grief. Sometimes it's not public if it's not a public grief. But when it's a public grief like ours was, 1,000 people showing up at the funeral and so forth, and people flying in from all over the country. When it's a public grief, over time, you start to just like package that up and you bury it. And I've seen videos, and maybe you've seen this too, where they'll show, grief, and they'll show people like building around it. And that's the model they're offering to people. That's not a good model. That's leaving us with darkness inside of us. And when people start to rebuild, they're carrying all this heaviness with them. So it's no wonder they're not successful. It's no wonder it gets super hard. And so they go right back into grieving. And if you do that enough times, some people will do it 2 or 3 times. Some people will do it 10 times. But there's a point at which you do it enough times that you go back to grieving and you say, this is all there is. And that's why you hear you'll grieve the rest of your life. This is because these are people that have stepped into rebuilding and then been pulled right back into their grief and coping. And so there's these steps missing in between. There's this understanding that's missing. There's this discovery that's missing. There's this resolving that's missing that needs to happen in order for us to go into rebuilding. This happens all the time. Really interesting that, when I work with clients, as we go through this process, towards the end, they start asking me, will you help me with my business? Interesting that I thought I should do business coaching. And because it's natural. It's natural once we feel that lift, once we feel that clearing, once we feel that re-energized feeling of love and gratitude again, once we go back into that place, which is the place where we feel good. Once we experience that again, once we find that again, we want to do something more. And that's why we get interested in life again. And it's like a rebirth, and it's a refinding of ourselves and a better version. I think about the butterfly. When we're in grief, we're like that caterpillar that has gone into the cocoon. They don't emerge back out as caterpillar. They emerge back out with their wings and with freedom. There's a special kind of freedom that comes from resolving your grief. I know you know this too, Coz, because I know the experiences that you've had and that you've come out as a butterfly, if you don't mind me saying so, transformed.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Yeah.
Miraculous. That's the word. You should put that in the title of your book.
I shouldn't I? Oh, there were so many titles and so many options in that book, and it just ended up being such a beautiful experience to write that and to offer this gift. I when I wrote this book, I didn't consider myself a writer. I didn't consider myself a writer at all. That's why I do a podcast, for heaven's sakes.
It's a lot easier, isn't it?
I'm a speaker. I'm not a writer, right?
That's right.
But as I wrote that book, like so many impressions, so many inspired moments. And when the editor sent it back to me, like, miracles around writing this book. Like I had set a schedule for myself. I had set a publish date, and then I was going to self-publish. I had decided that I was going to self-publish. I didn't really even seek a publisher. And then a publisher reached out to me and said, we would love to publish your book, and we would love to publish it, we would love to have it by this spring so we can publish it this summer. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're on the same timeline I am. This must be right. I already had set that up. I had already started the process. But so many miracles. And when I got it back from the editor and I was questioning, how we question ourselves? Mm-hmm. We all do it. And I was really questioning, is this good enough? Is this good enough to put into print? Is this good enough to offer to the world? It's very vulnerable to put a book into the world. And as I reread what the editor sent me, I thought, I didn't write this book. This is God's gift to the people who are going to read it. It's not mine. It's his. There's no doubt in my mind.
That's when you say to yourself, as we all have that experience when we tap into the divine, this doesn't come to you, it comes through you.
Yeah. Well, funny story though, I said to my husband, I said, are you nervous about me writing a book? And he laughed. He says, no, you say everything on the podcast already. I said, well, if you were writing a book, I'd be nervous. So
that's totally fair. Hey, let's give a copy of your book away tonight here on the show.
That would be so fun. I would love that.
Here is Julie's email, julie@buildalifeafterloss.com, julie@buildalifeafterloss.com. Go ahead, grab your phone. You're going to have to multitask because you're watching this live right now. And if you watch the rebroadcast on YouTube, on demand on Coz.tv, or you're listening to the audio on the Coz Green audio experience, you can still email Julie. You just won't be eligible for the book. But now you have her email in case you need to reach out to her with questions and to be able to seek her counsel. So email now, julie@buildalifeafterloss.com, julie@buildalifeafterloss.com, and you'll be entered into the drawing tonight to receive a copy of Julie's new book, Miracles in the Darkness, Building a Life After Loss.
A signed copy. I will send you a signed copy. And I have, all the intentions in my heart that this is going to go to someone that this can serve, that this can be a light in their life.
And it's amazing how that works out.
Yep.
I mean, it really is. I am just blown away whenever I've made offers to do things. And then it comes back to you that was like the person who needed it the most.
Yeah.
And
I had someone tell me a miracle story recently that their friend had gone into the library looking for a book that would to help the person that I was talking to. And they had just a few minutes and they found my book on the shelf. Wow. And they were like, is this the book? This is a tragedy. And the answer became very clear when they saw the lighthouse and they had a special connection with the lighthouse, that this was the book.
Well, when I saw the cover, I knew that there was a special connection because a lighthouse is a symbol for me. I remember I was up in Portland, Maine, and I came around a bend on a road, and there was that famous lighthouse right there on the coast of Portland, and I had seen that. I don't know if I'd seen it in a picture as a child or whatever, but I'd seen it before. And I'd never seen a particular lighthouse that looked like that. But when I saw it, I knew that was my lighthouse. And that has just been a symbol for me because it was just yesterday. It was either yesterday or today. All my days blend together since I don't sleep. But I just posted that we're all lighthouses for someone. And that we have to realize that your uniqueness is a light. And it is our sacred responsibility to share that light, to make the world a better place, one person at a time.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that.
We have a response here through Facebook that says, Susan says, I don't email. but Susan wants to win.
We'll enter you, Susan.
Yeah, she's going to write this down, Susan. So
I wrote it down already.
She's writing it down. So we all go through loss and grief, and no one is exempt. That's part of our human experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
What would you like to leave with our audience today? What's one key takeaway that they can make that step from, as you said, coping to rebuilding?
I would invite you to look around at the things that you're watching, at the things that you're looking at the things that you're surrounding yourself. And in order to keep hope alive, you want to surround yourself with those things that are going to inspire hope, There are a lot of people go to Facebook for support, which is great. But as I have looked around, the grief support on Facebook is lacking. The grief support on Facebook is you're going to grieve the rest of your life. And so you want to look at what you're feeding yourself, because you really want to make sure that whatever you're feeding yourself is growing your hope, not your despair. Grow your hope.
That's powerful. Absolutely. Again, the book is Miracles in the Darkness, Building a Life After Loss, and also the Building a Life After Loss podcast.
And it's Build a Life After Loss. So the book is Building a Life, the subtitle, okay. But the website is Build a Life After Loss, because it's already long enough. We didn't need to add the
ing. It was more money for the ing.
That's right. We're cheap over here. We went to Walmart. No, sorry. For our podcast website.
That's awesome. Julie Cluff, thank you so much for sharing time with us tonight, sharing your tragic yet miraculous stories. The death of your brother by suicide, the loss of your marriage, and then the loss of your two baby angels in a traffic accident. I can't even comprehend. So thank you for being vulnerable tonight, sharing with us your story and your way back from how you went beyond coping to actually rebuilding. We appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as we close always here on the broadcast, it seems to be the theme tonight, but I remind you, like never before, keep smiling, shine brightly, like a lighthouse, because someone out there is wandering aimlessly through the dark who needs to be guided by your light.